The smoke was the first wrong thing. Caleb Stone pulled the reins, and the horse stopped without argument. He sat on the wagon bench with one hand still holding the leather, staring at the thin gray thread rising from the chimney of a house that had been empty for 3 years. The deed in his coat pocket said so. The lawyer Holt had said so. Abandoned. No known occupants. Clear title pending. The smoke did not care what the deed said. He stepped down. Boots hit red dust. The gate ahead leaned on one hinge, the wood gray and splitting, held together by old habit. Beyond it, the yard was dry grass and silence. The house sat low against the afternoon light walls, dark with age. Porch sagging on one side. He stood at the gate. The smoke kept rising. We'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop a comment below and say hello. And if these stories have been bringing you some comfort, we'd sure be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. It helps us keep making them. Thank you. He pushed the gate open. It groaned the whole way. Caleb walked across the yard slowly, not cautious, the way a man is cautious around danger, but the way a man is cautious around something he hasn't figured out yet. The dry grass cracked under his boots. A grasshopper jumped from nowhere and landed in the dust. The heat pressed down flat and even, the way it did in late summer when the land had been baked too long and didn't bother cooling at night anymore. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Through the single small window beside the door, he could see the glow of a fire in the hearth. Not bright, just steady. The kind of fire that had been going a while. Someone had fed it recently. Someone knew how much wood to add. He went up the 3 steps. The middle one bowed under his weight. His hand found the door handle iron, worn smooth in the center, where a palm had gripped it 1,000 times. He pushed. The hinges didn't squeal. Someone had oiled them. The room was small and low-ceilinged. A table near the window. A chair. A woman sitting in that chair with a length of dark fabric across her lap and a needle in her hand. She was looking at him before he'd finished opening the door, not startled, not rising, not reaching for anything, just looking. The way you look at something you've been expecting. Her dress was the blue-gray of old work clothes, worn soft at the elbows. Her hair was pulled back, a few strands loose at the side of her face. She looked to be in her mid-20s. Her eyes were steady. She set the needle down on the table. Neither of them spoke. The fire popped once in the hearth. "You're the one who bought it?" she said. Not a question. Her voice was even. The way a person's voice gets when they've had time to prepare. Caleb kept his hand on the door frame. "Signed the papers this morning." She nodded, just slightly, looked back down at the fabric in her lap, smoothed it once with her palm. Then she set it on the table beside the needle, folded, like she was finished with something. "I figured it'd be soon," she said. He looked around the room, slowly, the hearth, a tin cup on the mantel, a wool blanket folded over the back of the chair. The floor was swept. The table was clean. Whoever she was, she hadn't been hiding. She'd been living here. "How long?" he asked. She met his eyes. 2 years. Come September. He took his hand off the doorframe. Outside, his horse shifted its weight, and the wagon creaked once and went quiet. 2 years. The whole time the land had been listed as vacant. The whole time Holt had been telling him the property was clear. No complications. Nothing to worry about. He looked at her again. She looked back, still calm, still waiting. And there was something in that stillness that told him she wasn't afraid of what he was going to do next, which meant she'd already decided what she was going to do. He just didn't know what that was yet. She poured 2 cups before he said a word. Caleb came in from the barn when the light was still low and orange along the ground, his shirt already damp at the back from the walk across the yard. Grace was at the stove, cast iron, black with years of use, and she moved the way people move when they know a space well, without looking, without hesitation. She lifted the tin pot and filled both cups and set one on the edge of the table nearest the door, not at his seat, at the edge, like she was leaving it somewhere, not handing it to him. He picked it up, sat down. The coffee was black and bitter and hot enough to sting, and he drank it without comment. She stood at the window with her own cup, looking out at the yard. They ate what there was cornbread she'd made on the griddle, hard on the outside and just barely soft in the middle, the kind that came from a pan that had too much heat and not quite enough time. He didn't complain. She didn't apologize. They ate, and the fire in the hearth worked itself down to coals, and the morning pushed more light through the small window. When she set her cup down, she said, "Come on." He followed her out. She walked the perimeter of the property the way a person walks land they know by memory rather than by sight, not looking where she stepped, head up, eyes moving to what she was pointing at before her hand came up to point. The fence line on the north side, 3 posts down, the wire rusted through. The roof of the small storage shed 2 planks gone, the gap wide enough that a bad rain would ruin anything stored inside. The water trough near the barn, cracked along the bottom seam, filled with dry leaves. She didn't say, "This is broken," or "This needs fixing." She just showed him. He looked at each thing, the fence, the shed, the trough. He didn't write anything down. He had the kind of memory that worked better without notes, the kind built from years of looking at land and understanding what it needed the way a doctor understands a body by where it hurt. They came around to the east side of the yard where the ground sloped slightly downward toward a ring of stacked stone. The well. The rim was chest high, built from flat limestone, fitted without mortar, each stone chosen for how it sat against the next. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. Grace stopped at the rim, put her hand flat on the top stone. Her fingers moved along the surface until they found the groove. She didn't look down to find it. She pressed into it, and Caleb stepped closer and looked letters carved shallow into the limestone. T. Holloway, 1871. "My father built this," she said. Her voice was the same as it had been all morning. Even that fall, before the first hard, dry spell. He said if you don't put the well in before August, you won't make it to the following year. Caleb leaned over the rim and looked down. The bottom was cracked earth, deep cracks, the kind that formed when something had dried out completely and then stayed that way. No moisture, no sound. "He passed 3 years ago," and she said, "Spring of '83. He straightened up. The sun was getting higher and the shadows were shortening, and somewhere in the brush beyond the fence a bird was making a sound. It repeated without variation. The paperwork, the deed, the land record, everything he had, it was in the storage building behind the house, the one he used as an office. She paused, took her hand off the stone. It burned. Nobody could say why. The fire marshal came out from Drywell, wrote something in his book, and that was the last I heard. Nobody investigated. He wrote it down in his book. Caleb said nothing. A horsefly landed on the stone rim and walked in a slow circle. Grace watched it without expression. "After that," she said, "I stayed. I didn't have the papers, but I had the land, and nobody came for a while. And then the notices started. I thought about going to people in the circuit court, anyone who might listen, but every time I got close to trying, I thought about the shed, about the county records. She stopped, pressed her lips together once. There was a neighbor, East Parcel. She said it carefully, like a word she'd handled before and put back down. His name is in my father's ledger, as a witness. Did you go to him once? She looked at the rim of the well. He came to the door, looked at me for a long time, said he couldn't help, closed the door. She pulled a dry stem of grass from between two stones and turned it in her fingers. I didn't go back. I was afraid that if I pushed, whoever was watching him would push back on him. He's an old man alone. Caleb filed that away. He looked at the carved letters again. T. Holloway, 1871. A man who'd cut his name into limestone because he'd meant to stay. Holt, Caleb said. The lawyer who sold me this land. He kept his voice level. Did he know about your father? About the fire? Grace turned her head and looked at him. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. It was all in how she held his gaze steady, without surprise, without bitterness. The look of someone who had thought through every part of this and arrived at the only conclusion there was. Caleb looked back at the dry well for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to pull my gear from the barn and set up proper. I'll sleep out there a while longer. Give us both room. She watched him. I need to look at the fence line, the shed, the trough. He picked up his hat from where he'd rested it on the stone rim, settled it back on his head. That'll take a week. Probably. And she said, all right. He walked back toward the barn. He didn't look back. But halfway across the yard, he stopped and bent down and pressed two fingers into the dirt dry, all the way down as far as he could reach. He stood back up and kept walking. A week. He'd told himself a week. But the lawyer Holt had sold him a property and told him it was clear and empty, and somewhere in that small stack of paperwork folded in his coat, there was a man's name and a notary seal. Caleb was already thinking about what it meant that Holt had signed off on a sale without once mentioning the woman who'd been living inside for 2 years, or the fire that had taken her father's papers, or why neither of those things had found their way into the deed. The fence posts were cedar, the old ones, and cedar lasted if it had been set right, but whoever had driven these hadn't gone deep enough. Caleb found that out the first morning he walked the north line post after post with too much give, rocking when he pushed them, the wire pulling loose where the tension had nowhere solid to hold. He went back to the barn and found a post driver, older than anything he owned. The iron head cracked along one side, but still weighted right. He started at the far corner and worked his way in. The work was simple in the way that real work is simple, not easy, but clear. There was a problem, and there was a way to fix it. Drive the post until it stopped moving, reattach the wire, move to the next one. The sun came up, and the heat built steadily, and the back of his shirt soaked through and dried and soaked through again. He worked without hurrying. Around mid-morning, he heard footsteps in the grass behind him and turned to find a tin cup sitting on the flat top of the fence post nearest him. Grace was already walking back toward the house, the hem of her dress brushing through the dry grass, not looking back. He picked up the cup, drank. The water was from the bucket, cool when it left the house, just slightly warm now from the walk across the yard. He set the empty cup back on the post and kept working. She came out again in the afternoon and knelt at the far edge of the yard, where the soil was slightly less baked and she started working the ground with a short-handled hoe. He could see her from where he was, the blue-gray dress, the steady motion of her shoulders. She turned the soil in rows, slow and even, stopping to pull rocks out and set them aside. Turnips, he guessed, from the spacing, or radishes, the kind of root vegetables that could still go in this late in summer and finish before the... He kept his eyes on the wire. By evening, the north line was done. He stood at the last post with the driver resting against his thigh and looked at the line of fence running back toward the house. Even, solid. He pressed one of the middle posts with his palm, no give. He picked up the driver and turned toward the house. Grace was on the porch, leaning against the near post, watching. When he looked at her, she turned and went inside. The door stayed open. He put the tools away and washed his hands at the pump behind the barn, cold water. The kind that came from depth, and dried them on the back of his trousers and went up the porch steps and in through the open door. She had the table set. 2 plates, 2 cups, the iron pan still on the stove, beans and salt pork, and what was left of the morning's cornbread. She sat down first, and he sat across from her, and they ate. The light outside shifted from orange to purple, and the first moths came to the window screen. He said, "What did you plant today?" She looked up. Like the question surprised her, but only a little. Turnips along the south bed, some radishes near the wall. The wall holds heat. They'll come up faster there. He nodded. He knew that about walls. She pulled a piece of cornbread apart and said, without looking at him, "Where were you before here?" "Montana," he said. "Before that, Kansas." "Ranching. Some other things." She didn't push. He appreciated that. They ate a while longer. The moths bumped softly against the window screen. Then she said, "My mother planted that south bed first. First spring we were here. She was out there before the ground was really ready. My father kept telling her to wait another 2 weeks." She paused. Just one breath. She never waited for anything. She stopped, set the bread down, looked at the edge of the table. He said, "I know that kind of stopping." She looked up at him briefly, then she looked back at the table. She didn't ask what he meant. He didn't offer more. Outside, through the window, he could see the east field going dark against the pale sky. He'd noticed an old man standing at the fence line over there in the late afternoon, just standing, looking this direction, the way a man looks when he's trying to decide something. When Caleb had glanced over, the man gave a single nod. Caleb had nodded back. The man had turned and walked into his rows of corn, and that was all. The dishes were cleared. Grace lit the oil lamp and set it on the table, and the light made the room smaller and warmer. She said, "The shed roof, there's boards in the barn. One's my father cut and stacked. Might be enough. I'll look tomorrow." He slept that night in the barn on his cot and lay there listening to the horse breathe in the next stall, and thought about the old man at the fence line. One nod, then gone. Grace had said she'd gone to him once, that he'd closed the door. But a man who wanted nothing to do with this wouldn't stand at his fence line watching. A man who was truly finished watching would stay inside his house. Caleb stared at the barn ceiling in the dark and turned that over slowly. The neighbor wasn't done. He just hadn't decided yet. They came on a Thursday, which Caleb knew because he'd been in Drywell on Wednesday for wire and had counted the days since. He heard the horses first, 3 of them, coming up the road at a measured pace, not fast, not slow. The kind of pace that says we're not in a hurry because we don't need to be. He came around from the barn side with a length of wire still coiled in his left hand and stopped at the corner of the building, 3 horses tied at the gate, 3 men already in the yard. Grace was on the porch. She hadn't come down the step. The man in front was tall and narrow through the shoulders, dressed in a wool vest with a fine stripe in it. The kind of vest that cost more than most men in Drywell made in a month. His hat was clean. His boots had been cleaned recently enough that the dust of the road hadn't fully settled into the leather yet. He had a calm face, not a kind face, but calm. The kind of calm that comes from being very rarely told no. The two men behind him were broader, quieter, standing with their hands loose at their sides, not reaching for anything, just present. The way furniture is present, placed there. Caleb set the coil of wire down against the barn wall and walked across the yard toward the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, below Grace, and turned to face the man. "Mr. Stone," the tall man said. When Caleb came around the corner, he smiled. "Harlan Voss, Coldwater Land Company." He said it the way a man says a name he expects to be recognized. Caleb didn't offer his hand. Voss didn't seem to notice, or chose not to. "We've been hoping to speak with both of you," Voss said. He glanced up at Grace on the porch. "Miss Holloway, good to see you're keeping well." Grace said nothing. Her hand rested on the porch post. Her face was exactly what it always was, level. Already arrived at wherever she needed to be before any of this started. Voss reached into his vest and produced a folded document. He held it toward Caleb. "I won't take much of your time. The company has been patient about this matter. But there's a process. And the process requires we deliver this in person." Caleb took the document, unfolded it. The paper was heavy, good quality, with a heading printed across the top, "Coldwater Land Company Notice of Claim and Petition for Vacatur." Below that, a legal description of the property lot numbers, dimensions, the county name. Below that, a column of language he had to read twice to understand. The claim was that Coldwater Land Company held a recorded deed to this property dated 1878, that any subsequent transfer, including the one recorded through Holt's office, was subject to review pending resolution of the prior claim, that the current occupants had 30 days to vacate voluntarily before the company would seek a court order. He folded it back up. "The property was listed as abandoned," he said. "I bought it through a licensed broker. We're aware of that." Voss was still pleasant, still patient. "Mr. Holt's transaction will need to be reviewed by the court. That's not something you need to concern yourself with directly. The company isn't pursuing any claim against you personally, just against the land. We're simply clarifying ownership." He tilted his head slightly, "which has never, legally speaking, been entirely unambiguous." Caleb looked at the document in his hand. Then he looked at Voss. The man's boots were dusty now, the way boots got after standing in a dry yard for several minutes. He had a ring on his right hand, silver, with some kind of engraving on the face. The two men behind him were watching the middle distance, watching the way men watch when they've been told to be visible but not active. "You said 1878, Caleb said. "That's when the deed was recorded." "Yeah, Thomas Holloway bought this land in 1869. Something moved in Voss's face. Not much, a small recalibration. "Are you in possession of documentation to that effect?" Caleb didn't answer. Voss held the pause for a moment, then let it go with a slight exhale through the nose. "The company would be willing to offer Miss Holloway a settlement for the inconvenience. It wouldn't be a large sum, but given the circumstances—" "No." That came from the porch. Grace's voice. One word, flat and final. "The way you close a door." Voss looked up at her. His smile was patient. The smile of a man who has heard no before and knows how to wait it out. Miss Holloway, I understand this land has personal significance. That's exactly why we'd prefer to resolve this without involving the courts. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the horsefly on the well rim, watching it without urgency, waiting for it to finish whatever it was going to do. Voss turned back to Caleb. I'd encourage you to consider your position carefully. Mr. Stone, you've made improvements to a property that may not ultimately be yours to improve. That's an uncomfortable situation for any man. He tucked his hands into the pockets of his vest, easy and unhurried. We'll expect a response before the 30 days are out. Good afternoon. He turned and walked back to the gate. The two men fell in behind him. They mounted. Voss pushed the gate aside without looking at it and rode out, and the sound of hooves moved down the road and faded into dust. Caleb stood in the yard holding the document. The heat sat on everything. The bird in the brush beyond the fence had gone silent the whole time the men were there, and it started up again now, the same call as before. He heard Grace come down the porch steps. She stopped beside him and looked at the road where the dust was still settling. You knew they'd come, he said. I knew they'd come again. The weight on the last word told him this wasn't the first notice, wasn't the first visit, wasn't the first time she'd stood in this yard and watched someone leave with a promise to return. He looked down at the document. Recorded deed, 1878. 9 years after Thomas Holloway put a well in and carved his name into stone. If your father bought this land in 1869, there'd be a county record. The deed would have been filed. It was filed. Her voice was even. The county records office in Harmon had a fire in 1880. Burned a section of the land records from 1865 to 1872. She paused. 3 years before the storage shed burned and took my father's copy. Caleb looked at her. She looked back at him. Her face showed him nothing he hadn't already started to piece together, and she knew he was piecing it. And neither of them said the word for what 2 fires at 2 convenient times added up to. I need to go to town, he said. Burl's office won't help you. I know. He folded the document and put it in his coat pocket. I'm not going to Burl's office. He went to the barn and saddled his horse and rode out before the light had moved much off its afternoon angle. The road to Drywell was dry and straight, and the horse moved easy under him, and he kept his hands loose on the reins and thought about Holt's signature on the deed, the one that said clear title pending, and about the fact that a licensed broker in a county seat didn't file a sale without doing a title search first. A title search that would have turned up a competing claim from 1878, or would have, if someone had looked. The question that sat in his chest the whole ride in wasn't whether Holt had made a mistake. It was whether Holt and Voss had ever been in the same room together, and if so, how long ago that room had been. Holt's office was locked. Caleb stood at the door and read the hand-lettered card tucked into the frame back Thursday. It was Thursday. He stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked down the main street of Drywell toward the building at the far end with the word Sheriff painted in black across the window. The office smelled of old paper and coal dust, and something underneath coffee that had been boiling too long and then abandoned. Sheriff Burl was at his desk, a big man gone soft through the middle, with a white mustache that needed trimming and eyes that were still sharp in a face that had stopped trying to look it. He was reading something when Caleb came in, and he finished the line before he looked up. He said, "Not surprised, not pleased, just acknowledged." Caleb put the cold water notice on the desk and sat down in the chair across from him without being invited. The chair had one short leg and rocked when he settled his weight, so he shifted and found the balance point and stayed there. Burl picked up the notice. Read it slowly. The way men read who learned later in life, moving through each line with full attention before moving to the next. When he was done, he set it back on the desk and folded his hands on top of it. Voss, he said. I know the company. Burl looked at the notice rather than at Caleb. Coldwater's been buying up land in this county for going on 4 years. They move slow, file their paperwork right, use lawyers that know the process better than most judges do. He paused. They haven't lost a case yet, far as I know. Thomas Holloway bought that land in 1869, Caleb said. Before I know what Thomas Holloway did. The sheriff's voice was flat, not unkind. I was deputy in this county when he filed. I saw the paperwork. Caleb leaned forward slightly. Though, what I know and what I can act on are two different things. Burl turned the notice on the desk, straightened it against the edge. The county records from that period burned in 1880. Coldwater filed their claim after the fire. Their deed is what's on record now. That's the legal reality of it. Whatever you and I might think about how it got to be that way, both fires. Burl looked up. The county records, Caleb said. And Holloway's storage building, 3 years ago, both burned. Both took the same documents. The office was quiet. A fly moved along the window glass in slow arcs. Outside, someone drove a wagon past, and the sound came through the wall and faded. Burl said, You're not from here? No. Then you don't know what Coldwater's reach looks like in a county this size. He said it without emphasis, a fact being placed on a table. They don't threaten people. They don't need to. They file paperwork and they wait and they have lawyers in Harmon who eat this kind of case for breakfast. He picked up his coffee cup, looked into it, set it back down without drinking. I tried to file a formal objection back in '82 when the notices first started. The circuit judge sent it back, said I didn't have standing without physical documentation. Caleb kept his voice level. What do you actually need to move on this? Burl was quiet. He looked at the rifle on the wall, single shot. The finish, worn off the stock, hung there long enough to collect a thin layer of dust on the barrel. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's made a separate peace with. Original documentation of prior purchase. He said finally. Witnessed, dated, specific, something I can take to the circuit judge that doesn't come from a burned building. He paused. Or a witness who was present at the original transaction. Someone still living who can testify to what they saw. And if I bring you that, then I can make a referral to the circuit court and request a stay on the eviction. He set both hands flat on the desk. I'm not saying I won't help you. Stone, I'm saying I need something to stand on first. Caleb stood up. He took the Coldwater notice off the desk and folded it back into his coat. Burl said, She's still out there, the Holloway girl. Her name is Grace. I know her name. Something shifted in the older man's voice, not guilt exactly, but the sound of a man who had carried a thing as far as he believed he could and had stopped short of where it needed to go. Tell her I asked after her. Caleb walked out. The ride back was longer into the heat, the horse working against a headwind that had come up from the south and pushed fine grit into his face the whole way. He kept his hat pulled down and thought about what Burl had said. Original documentation, a witness still living. He thought about what Grace had told him that morning at the well, about the storage building, about the county records, about the neighbor who'd closed his door. When he came up the drive, she was in the yard pulling dry grass from along the base of the south wall. She stood when she heard the horse and watched him dismount and tie up at the post. He came across the yard and stopped. Burl needs documentation, he said. Original deed or a living witness to the purchase. He'll go to the circuit court if we give him something he can use." Grace looked at him. Her hands had dry grass caught in the fingers, and she pulled it free slowly, stem by stem. "Come inside," she said. He followed her in. She went to the kitchen, to the corner near the stove, and knelt down. He watched her press her fingers into the seam between two floorboards, finding the spot by feel, not by sight, and lift. The board came up clean, cut short, pivoting on a notch he wouldn't have found without knowing exactly where to press. Underneath a tin box, the size of a small Bible, the lid spotted with rust along the edges. She lifted it out and stood and placed it on the table. She didn't open it. She stood back, one hand resting on the table's edge, and looked at the box and not at him. "I kept it because I didn't know who to give it to," she said. Something in her voice had shifted, not quite hesitation, but the sound of a person who had made a decision and was still feeling the full weight of it land. "Every time I thought about going to someone, Burl, the circuit court, anyone I thought about, the shed, about the county records." She stopped, drew one slow breath through her nose. "If those burn, this could too, or disappear some other way." Caleb looked at the box. "And I didn't know," she said quietly. "If the person I brought it to was the kind of person who could be trusted with it." He understood what she was telling him. Not just about the box. About him. About the 3 weeks he'd been here and what she'd been measuring the whole time. In small, careful increments, without ever saying so. He sat down at the table. "Open it." She opened it. Inside a leather-bound ledger. Small. The cover darkened with age and handling. The spine still tight. Beneath it, a folded envelope, unsealed. The address line started and then stopped as though the writer had begun, and then couldn't settle on who to send it to. Grace lifted the ledger out and placed it in front of him. He opened it. The handwriting inside was careful, slanted, done in brown ink that had faded but held. His eyes moved down the first page dates, acreages, dollar amounts, names of parties. A record of every transaction Thomas Holloway had made on this land going back to 1869. At the top of the first page, underlined twice, "Purchase of land." Section 14, Drywell County, September 4th, 1869. Witnessed by E. Pruitt, neighbor, East Parcel. Caleb read the name twice. He looked up. E. Pruitt. He kept his voice even. "The man on the East Parcel, the one with the corn." Grace nodded once. "Is he still there?" She nodded again. Caleb looked back at the ledger. Elias Pruitt. The old man who'd stood at the fence line in the late afternoon and given one quiet nod and walked back into his rows of corn. A witness to the original purchase. Still on the same land after 23 years. And he had never come forward. The question settled into Caleb's chest. Cold and still, the man had closed his door on Grace when she came to him. But he still stood at that fence line and watched. Still gave that single nod. What exactly was Elias Pruitt afraid of? And was that fear larger than what he owed? Grace found out on a Tuesday at the dry goods counter of Mercer's store. She'd gone in for salt and a length of muslin and was waiting at the counter when she heard the women behind her, 2 of them. Wives of men she'd known by sight for years, speaking in the particular low voice that isn't trying to be quiet so much as trying to be overheard. Bought the property right out from under the claim. Apparently, nobody told him a thing. Or maybe he knew and didn't care. And she's still there, living in the house with him. A pause. The kind of pause that does more damage than words. "Well," Nobody forced her to stay. Grace set her coins on the counter. Mercer took them without meeting her eyes. He wrapped the salt in paper and pushed the muslin across without looking up, and she picked both items up and walked out. The street was bright and flat and hot. She walked to her wagon, put the things in the back, climbed up, and drove home. She kept her hands even on the reins and her eyes straight on the road. She was halfway back before she noticed her jaw had been clenched the whole time, and it ached now at the hinge, a dull throb that spread up toward her left ear. She did not stop. She did not let herself think about it until the wagon was back in the yard, and the horse was tied and she was inside with the door closed behind her. Then she stood in the middle of the kitchen with the salt and the muslin still in her arms and stared at the wall opposite, and breathed. The wall had a crack in the plaster that ran from the window frame down toward the floor. She'd looked at it every day for 2 years. She looked at it now. She set the things on the table and went back to work. When Caleb came in that evening from Drywell, where he'd gone for nails, he found her at the table with her hands flat on the surface and nothing in front of her. He looked at her and set the nails on the shelf and sat down across from her without being asked. She told him what she'd heard, all of it, exactly as it had been said. She kept her voice even and watched his face while she spoke. His jaw tightened once a small movement, barely visible, and then he looked at the table between his hands and stayed there. "Did Mercer say anything?" he asked. He looked at the coins, counted them, wrapped the salt. Caleb, nothing. "There's more," she said. "A boy outside the feed store told me Coldwater's men were at the sheriff's office again yesterday morning, and afterward they went to the Grange Hall and spoke for close to an hour." She paused. "I don't know what was said in there." He pushed back from the table and stood. He went to the window and looked out at the road, empty, dusty, the light pulling toward orange. The clouds from the west sat lower than they had yesterday, and the air coming through the window screen had something faintly different in it. Not cool, but less emptied out than it had been. He said, "I'll go to Mercer's tomorrow, pick up a few things." He went the next morning. He was inside less than 2 minutes before he heard his own name from the 2 men near the stove. The words weren't low. They weren't meant to be. Somebody ought to have told him before he signed anything. Doubt he'd have listened. "Look at the man," Caleb set a tin of boot oil on the counter. He counted out the coins. Mercer took them the same way he'd taken Grace's eyes on the money, not on the face. Caleb picked up the tin and walked out and stood for a moment on the board sidewalk in the full, flat heat of the morning, the sun pressing down on the back of his neck, the smell of horse and dust rising off the street in front of him. He stood there long enough for 2 men passing on horseback to slow and look at him, and then look away. He rode home into the headwind, hotter going back than coming in. That night the clouds were darker to the west. The air had the faint smell of something building, not rain yet, not close, but the distant memory of what rain smells like when the earth has been waiting long enough for it. He sat on the porch steps after supper and felt it move across his face and the backs of his hands. Grace came out and stood at the porch post. She didn't look at him right away. She looked west, at the clouds, at the way the last of the daylight was sitting on their lower edges. "I want you to think about something," she said. He looked up at her. "You could sell this back. Whatever Holt will give you, or find another buyer." She said it straight out, the way she said everything, no softening in it, no apology. But she was looking at the clouds, not at him, and her hand on the porch post had the knuckles slightly white. "You haven't been here long enough for this to cost you what it costs me." You could walk away without much lost. He looked at the road. Where would I go? Anywhere. Montana. You said, Montana's behind me. She was quiet. He turned the boot oil tin in his hands. He'd been holding it without knowing. Carried it out from supper without thinking. The metal was warm from the table. I had a wife, he said. In Kansas. Before Montana. He kept his eyes on the tin. She died in the spring of '81. Fever. Fast. He set the tin on the step beside him. After that, I was in one place for a while, then somewhere else for a while. Montana was the last somewhere else. The porch post didn't move. Grace didn't move. I bought this land because it was cheap and because Holt said it was clear, and because I needed something I could put work into. He looked at the road. That was the whole of it when I signed the paper. I wasn't trying to do a thing for anybody. The wind came slow through the dry grass along the fence line. But I've been here 3 weeks, he said, and I have seen the well your father built, and the name he put in the stone, and the ledger you've been keeping under the floorboards. I know what those fires were. He stopped. I can't walk away from that. What came across her face then wasn't relief. It was something slower, the expression of a person who has been holding a door shut for a long time and has just been told she could stop, and doesn't yet trust that the thing on the other side is gone. She said, if we go to the circuit court with the ledger, we go in the morning, as early as you want. She nodded. She looked west again. The cloud line was moving, slow and certain. He sat on the steps a long while after she went in, and he thought about Elias Pruitt, who had been present when Thomas Holloway bought this land, who had signed his name to that ledger, who had closed his door on Grace when she came to him, and who still stood at his fence line in the late afternoon and watched. 23 years of silence. That kind of silence didn't come from not caring. It came from knowing exactly what you stood to lose, which meant whatever Coldwater held over Elias Pruitt was specific, real, and still in effect. If they went to the circuit court with only the ledger and no living witness, it wouldn't be enough. Burl had said so. Ashford would say the same. Caleb picked up the boot oil tin and went inside. Someone was going to have to walk across that dry field to the east parcel, and whatever answer came back from behind Elias Pruitt's door was going to determine everything that came after. If you've been following along with Caleb and Grace, we're so glad you're here. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and if these stories have been good company. We'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. It means more than you know. The circuit court met in Harmon, 12 miles east, in a building that had started life as a feed warehouse and still carried the smell of it grain dust settled into the corners, into the wood of the benches, into the plaster of the walls, where the sweep never fully reached. They left before first light, Grace on the wagon bench beside Caleb, the tin box in her lap with both hands resting on its lid. The lantern hung from the front post, throwing a small, moving circle of yellow on the road ahead. Neither of them talked much. The horse moved steady in the dark, and the sky began to separate itself from the land around the 5th mile, a pale line along the east that widened slowly. By the time they reached Harmon, the sun was clear of the horizon, and the town's main street was already moving wagons, men on foot, a dog crossing the road without looking at anything. The courthouse annex opened at 8. They were there at 7:40 and sat on the bench outside the locked door, Grace with the tin box, Caleb with his hat on his knee, A clerk unlocked at 8 exactly and looked at them without surprise and directed them to the second room on the left. The magistrate was a man named Ashford Compact, gray at the temples, reading glasses low on his nose. He listened to Caleb lay out the situation without interrupting. When Caleb finished, Ashford held out his hand for the ledger. He read it the way Burl had read the notice thoroughly, each page given full attention before turning to the next. He spent extra time on the purchase entry. He set the ledger on the desk. "This is a private record," he said, "kept by the party claiming ownership. That carries weight, but it's not self-authenticating under court standards." He looked at Grace over his glasses. "The witness listed here, E. Pruitt. Is that person?" Grace said. "He lives on the east parcel adjoining the property. He's been there since before my father bought our land." Ashford wrote something on a pad. "I can schedule a preliminary hearing for this afternoon. 2 o'clock. Coldwater Land Company will have the opportunity to respond. Bring your witness if you can reach him in time." He looked at Caleb. "I'll issue a temporary stay on the eviction notice pending the hearing." He wrote the stay on a separate sheet, stamped it, and handed it across. They had 6 hours. Caleb left Grace at the Harmon Dry Goods to wait and rode hard on horseback back toward the county line. Without the wagon, he cut the 12 miles in under an hour, the horse lathered and blowing when he pulled it up at the farm looked the same as it had from across the fence, the original house, narrow and low, 2 additions grafted to the south side, the kitchen garden green along the east wall, chickens working the yard, a wood pile under a lean-to, split neat and stacked with the cut faces out. He knocked. The door opened, and Elias Pruitt filled the frame, taller than he'd appeared at a distance, somewhere past 70. Thin through the chest, but wide in the hands, his face carrying the particular texture of the skin that has been outdoors in all weather for 50 years. His eyes were pale blue and clear, and they moved from Caleb to the horse and back. "Mr. Pruitt," Caleb said. "Caleb Stone, I bought the Holloway property. I know who you are." His voice was dry and unhurried. "There's a hearing this afternoon in Harmon, 2 o'clock. Circuit Magistrate." Caleb kept it plain and in order. "Coldwater Land Company has filed a competing deed claim dated 1878. The magistrate will issue a stay if we can bring a witness to the original purchase." He paused. "Your name is in Thomas Holloway's ledger as witness to the 1869 transaction." Elias Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked down at his own boots, old leather, worn down at the outer heel. He pressed his mouth together and let a breath out slow through his nose. "I know what I witnessed," he said. "Then you know what you could say at 2 o'clock. The old man didn't answer. He looked past Caleb toward the road, and his jaw worked once, like a man chewing on a word that hadn't come out right the first few times he'd tried it in private. Then he looked back. "My wife," he said. "She's been gone 11 years. I've got no one to leave this place to you." He said it like a man accounting for something, laying out a balance sheet. "When they came around Coldwater's people, they told me if I said anything, if I made any noise about what I'd seen in 69, they'd find a reason to contest my deed too. Said they had a recorder who could make things complicated." He stopped. "I believed them. I still believe them." He looked at Caleb steadily. "I'm not a brave man, Mr. Stone. I want to be clear about that before we go any further." Caleb waited. "But I've been watching that girl manage alone for 3 years, Elias said. "I watched her father put that well in. I watched him build that fence and plant that south garden and sink every dollar he had into that ground." He picked up his hat from the hook just inside the door. I should have gone to her sooner. I knew that the morning she came to my door, and I closed it on her. I've known it every day since. He put the hat on and stepped out. They rode back to Harmon with Elias on his own horse alongside Caleb. The old man sitting straight in the saddle in the way of someone who learned young and never forgot. He didn't speak much on the ride. Caleb didn't push him. Grace was waiting on the bench outside the annex when they arrived. She stood when she saw Elias come through the street with Caleb. Something moved across her face, a quick tightening, and then release. There and gone. She looked at the old man, and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke. But he took his hat off and held it in front of him with both hands, and gave a single, slow nod. She nodded back. The courtroom was 3/4 full by 2 o'clock men from the county, a few women, people who had come for other hearings or had heard something was happening. Voss was already there with a man in a dark coat who carried a leather satchel and sat very straight. Coldwater's lawyer arrived from the company's Harmon office less than a mile away. Voss saw Caleb come in and nodded once. The same pleasant nod as always. Ashford took the bench. He read the preliminary details. He asked Coldwater's lawyer to present the basis of their claim. The lawyer stood, smooth and practiced, exactly as Burl had described. He presented the 1878 deed with the county recording stamp, argued the legal precedence of recorded instruments over unrecorded ones, stated that the Holloway ledger was a private document with no official standing, that the county records of origin had been destroyed and could not be independently verified. He sat down. Ashford looked at Caleb. Caleb stood. He placed the ledger on the table in front of the magistrate. He said, "The purchase is recorded in this ledger in Thomas Holloway's hand, dated September 4th, 1869. A witness to that purchase is present and willing to testify." Coldwater's lawyer rose immediately. "Your Honor, a neighbor's recollection of events from—" "Sit down," Ashford said. He looked toward the back of the room. The witness, Elias Pruitt, stood up from the third bench. He was the oldest person in the room, and he moved like it getting his feet under him in stages, straightening slowly, each joint taking its turn. He walked to the front and stood before the magistrate's table and held his hat in both hands and did not look at Coldwater's lawyer. Ashford said, "You witnessed the original land purchase by Thomas Holloway in 1869. "I did." His voice was stronger here than it had been at his door. "September of that year. I remember it was a Saturday, because I'd been planning to ride to town, and Thomas came to the fence line in the morning and asked me to come over instead. He needed a witness for the papers." He stopped. Let the room settle. We'd had rain the week before. I remember because the ground was still soft, and my boots sank in when I crossed the low part of his field. He counted out $340 on the kitchen table. I watched him count it. I signed my name to his ledger right there in that kitchen. He paused once more. I may not remember every word that was spoken, but I remember the mud on my boots, and I remember the money. And I remember that Thomas Holloway shook my hand after and said he was going to put a well in before August. Coldwater's lawyer said, from his seat, "Can the witness explain why he failed to come forward in the 3 years since the eviction proceedings began?" Elias turned his head and looked at the lawyer for a long moment. His hands tightened once on his hat brim, then relaxed deliberately, finger by finger. "Because I was afraid," he said, not loud, not performing, just a fact stated to the room. The way a man states a fact when he has finished trying to make it sound like something else. "I was wrong to let that stop me. I'm telling you now because it's what I should have done 3 years ago. And it's past time." He turned back to Ashford. The room was very quiet. Ashford looked at the ledger. He looked at Coldwater's lawyer, who was looking at the table in front of him, with the careful expression of a man doing rapid arithmetic. He looked at Voss, who had gone still in his chair. He wrote. He stamped. He said, "I'm issuing a full stay on the eviction notice and referring the competing deed claim for formal title review by the County Land Office in Harmon. This court will reconvene in 30 days with findings." He looked at Coldwater's lawyer directly. "I expect full disclosure of all documentation related to the 1878 recording, including the circumstances under which that recording was made in the period following the 1880 county record's destruction." The lawyer's hand pressed flat and hard on the table. Caleb looked at Grace beside him. She was looking at the magistrate's table, one thumbnail pressed into her opposite palm, not hard, just resting there. The way you hold on to something small when you don't have anything else to hold. He leaned slightly toward her. 30 days. She let out one slow breath through her nose. Yes, outside afterward. Voss walked to his horse without looking at anyone. His lawyer fell in close beside him, and they spoke low for a moment. Then Voss mounted and rode east, without looking back. Elias Pruitt came out of the courthouse and stood in the afternoon sun and put his hat back on. Caleb came up beside him. "We'll get you back before evening," Caleb said. The old man nodded. He looked down the street, squinting into the light. He turned his hat brim in his hands once, a habit Caleb had noticed. "The 1878 deed," he said slowly. "The one Coldwater filed with the—" "What about it?" "The county recorder in 1880. The one who was in office when the records burned." He stopped, looked at Caleb. "His name was on the office door when I went in to file a deed correction in 1881, the year after the fire. I didn't think much of it at the time." Caleb waited. "His name was Voss," Elias said. "I figured it was a different Voss. Father, maybe, and your uncle." He looked back down the empty street. "I always wondered if anyone else had put that part together." The 30 days moved the way late summer days move in dry country, slowly at first, and then all at once, Caleb spent them working. There was enough to do that he didn't have to look for it. The shed roof came first. The boards his father-in-law had cut and stacked in the barn years ago were dry and ready, just needing to be lifted into place and nailed down. He did that in 2 days, working from first light until the heat made the roof too hot to kneel on. Then coming back in the late afternoon when the sun had moved off the south face. The water trough took longer. He had to pull the cracked section out in pieces and refit new wood. Then seal the seam with pitch he'd bought in Drywell. The gate he fixed in an afternoon, cutting a new hinge from flat iron stock and setting it with screws so it would hold longer than nails in dry wood. The well was the last thing, and the hardest. He went down into it on a rope on the 3rd week, a lantern tied to his belt and a short-handled pick in his right hand. The limestone walls were damp a foot below the surface, even though they looked dry from above. He worked 3 mornings, breaking through the cracked layer at the bottom, moving by feel as much as by sight in the narrow space. The smell of the earth close around him, mineral, faintly cool, older than anything above it. On the 4th morning, the pick broke through into softer ground, and water came up slowly around his boots, dark at first with the disturbed earth, then clear. He climbed out and stood at the rim and looked at the carved name, T. He lowered the bucket that evening, and it came back with 4 inches of clean water. By the next morning, 8. By the end of that week, full. Grace drew water from it without comment. She filled the trough and the kitchen pail and the watering can for the south bed and went about her days the same as she always had. But the 3rd morning, after the well came back, she set a second biscuit on his plate without being asked. And he understood that for what it was. Some mornings he caught himself looking at the road before he meant to. Each time he made himself stop and go back to the work in front of him. One rain wouldn't fix what the drought had done to the ground. One court hearing wouldn't fix what the Voss family had spent years building. He knew that. He kept his hands busy and waited. The letter from the Harmon Land Office arrived on a Thursday, the 28th day. Caleb was on the porch when the county rider came up the road and handed it down without dismounting and rode back the way he'd come. He turned the envelope in his hand's heavy paper, official seal pressed into the wax, and took it inside. Grace was at the stove. She turned when she heard him come in. He put the envelope on the table and sat down and opened it. The language was dense, and he read it twice. The County Land Office's formal title review had found the Coldwater Land Company's 1878 deed irregular specifically. The recording stamp bore a date sequence inconsistent with the office's own filing logs, which had been partially reconstructed from copies held in the Harmon District Archive. The review further noted that correspondence found in the archive referenced the 1869 Holloway purchase as a matter of established record at the time of the 1880 County Records fire. Confirming the prior claim, the Coldwater deed was being referred to the Territorial District Attorney's Office for further inquiry. All eviction proceedings were vacated. Title of Section 14, Drywell County, was confirmed in the name of Grace Holloway, heir to Thomas Holloway, effective immediately. He set the letter. Grace came over and read it where it lay, standing with one hand braced on the table's edge. He watched her eyes move down the page. She read it all the way through to the last line. Then she straightened. She went back to the stove and moved the pan off the heat, and stood there with her back to him, one hand on the iron handle. Her shoulders rose once and then settled. He looked at the table and gave her the time she needed. He folded the letter and set it on the shelf above the table where it would be easy to find. The next morning, Elias Pruitt came to the gate before 7. He didn't knock. He set a cloth sack down on the gate post and turned to go. And Caleb, who was at the pump behind the barn, saw him through the gap in the fence and came around. Pruitt. The old man stopped, turned. Caleb came to the gate and looked at the sack tied at the top with a length of twine, full of something loose and dry. Cornseed, Elias said. Good variety. My wife brought the first of it from Missouri 30 years ago. I've been saving a portion every fall since. Does well here if you get it in on time. He looked past Caleb toward the house. Grace knows how to plant it. Her mother used to come over every August and ask about the yield. Caleb picked up the sack. Elias reached out and pressed his thumb against the new hinge on the gate, testing the fit. The way a craftsman tests another man's work. Good. He walked back across the field to his corn without waiting for anything more. Caleb watched him go, the old man's back straight, his pace measured, taking the uneven ground between the rows with the unhurried care of someone who has learned what ground to trust. Caleb brought the seed inside and set it on the shelf next to the letter. That evening, the Drywell weekly paper came with the county rider's return run, folded and tucked into the fence post. Caleb read it at the table after supper. Coldwater Land Company had suspended operations in Drywell County, pending a district inquiry. One sentence, near the bottom of the county news column. No other details. No names beyond the company. He set the paper aside. The paper didn't mention Voss by name. In a county this size, it didn't need to. Supper that night was quiet and unhurried. Grace had slow-cooked beans since morning and made cornbread in the iron skillet and opened a jar of dried apple preserve she'd been keeping on the back shelf. She put it all on the table without ceremony, and they ate. The oil lamp burned between them, and the evening came down outside, the sky still holding some color in the west. When the dishes were cleared, she went to the window, and he heard the familiar scrape of the lamp base on the sill. He turned in his chair. She was setting the lamp on the ledge with her back to him, adjusting it so the light faced outward through the glass. "Why'd you always put it there?" he said. She kept her hands on the lamp a moment. Then she turned. "My mother did it first," she said. "Every night, as long as I can remember. She said a lamp in the window doesn't wait for anyone. It just tells people passing that there's someone home." She looked at the flame behind the glass. "After she died, my father kept doing it." He looked at the light in the window, amber, steady, facing the road and the dark fields and whatever was out there beyond the fence line. "That's a good reason." She looked at him. "There are 2 people home now," he said. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she took the dishcloth from the counter and folded it, corners even, the way she folded everything, and set it on the shelf. She moved to the door and pushed it open and stepped out onto the porch. He followed. The night was warm, and the sky to the west had a line of clouds sitting low on the horizon, darker than the rest of the dark, and the air moving from that direction had weight in it, not cold, not close, but present. The fields were quiet. The well was a pale ring of stone in the yard. The new water inside it invisible, but there. They stood on the porch and didn't speak for a while. Then the first drop hit the porch rail, 1 drop, the size of a coin, leaving a dark circle in the dry wood. Then another. Then 3 at once in the dust of the yard, each one punching a small crater. Grace put her hand out past the edge of the porch roof, and the rain hit her palm and ran between her fingers. She looked at her wet hand in the dark. 1 rain wouldn't fix the ground or the garden or the cracked earth along the fence line, but it was a start, and they both knew what a start was worth. The rain came across the fields in a wide, uppy line they could hear before it reached them, a sound like something large finally exhaling after holding its breath too long. It reached the yard, and the roof, and the stone of the well, and the smell of it came up from the earth immediately. The particular smell of water on dry ground that hasn't had any in too long. They stood there and listened to it fall. On the sill inside, the lamp burned through the window glass, facing the road. There is something in a story like this one, quiet, heavy, not entirely resolved, that stays with a person longer than the stories that end clean. Perhaps you've known a piece of land that mattered more than it should have. Perhaps you've waited for something a long time, not knowing if it would come. Perhaps you've stood in a doorway the way Elias stood in his, knowing what the right thing was and not yet finding the courage for it. Many of us have been there. We have held our silence too long, or stayed too far away from someone who needed us, or kept a thing hidden under the floorboards of ourselves because we weren't sure who could be trusted with it. It's all right. It's allowed to rest now. We are grateful you stayed with Caleb and Grace to the end of it. Thank you for listening, and for bringing your own quiet into this story for a little while.